we know there is a lot of dirty money flowing through Canada, into it and out of it. Yet we don't have the resources or the appropriate application of our legislation and regulations to actually tackle it. Where is this political will to get behind this? And why doesn't our government want to, or why don't they have the ability to back this a bit more?
Hi, welcome to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Inside Policy Talks podcast. I'm Alex Dalziel, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where I am the project lead for national security. In today's episode, I'm going to bring together three of the issues we've been talking about in previous episodes: financial crime, organized crime, and border security, by looking at a topic that doesn't always get the media attention, but as we'll see, is something of an active and under-prosecuted threat in the Canadian context. That's trade-based money laundering. So a type of money laundering that we'll hear more about, obviously in the context of the TD Bank news, etc. These issues are in the media space, and it's important to get a handle on some of the different ways that organized crime groups and others are laundering money to cover their illicit earnings. To do so, I'm again joined by someone who has both a practitioner aspect to this and a theoretical background, and that's Dr. Jamie Ferrill. Jamie, for almost a decade, worked with the Canada Border Services Agency before she went off and finished her education, finishing her doctoral degree. She now teaches in Canberra, Australia at the Charles Sturt University, where she is a senior lecturer and leads the financial crimes studies team. She hasn't forgotten Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Jamie. You're keeping some of your connections, I believe, with the as a research fellow at the University of Victoria and Western Washington University, doing some cross-border research, and that's on top of some other work with the Financial Integrity Hub at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. So thanks so much. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jamie, this concept, trade-based money laundering, can you give us a concise definition?
Sure. It's, really simply put, it's the process of disguising the proceeds of crime by moving value through the use of trade transactions in an attempt to legitimize those funds. So we have this dirty money that's been generated through things like drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking, sex trafficking, and that money needs to be cleaned in one way or another. Trade is one of the ways that that's done, usually through things like document fraud, phantom shipping, that kind of thing. So it's really manipulating our global trade system to disguise that dirty money and make it appear clean. But the money isn't actually moving, it's the value. So trade is moving the value either to the export or import to shift that money.
So maybe that's one of the key differences. We often imagine kind of, dirty bags of actually hard cash crossing the border, making their way probably south if you're talking about cocaine, maybe east if you're talking about fentanyl, or south and east. So it's really a different way to do it. Why would an organized criminal choose this option versus some of the more traditional versions of, moving cash, bulk cash, masking it through the financial system?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. It's really because of the sheer volume of trade and the complexities in the supply chain. It's a really effective way of integrating these large volumes of criminal proceeds with legitimate funds. And it's really attractive to organized crime groups specifically because it's hard to detect, it's hard to track, it's hard to investigate due to it inherently being transnational in nature. And that international trade system, like I said, is really complex. So while the act of the money laundering itself might not be overly complex, the supply chain is. So we have so many different entities along a supply chain, and no one really has oversight of the entire thing. Mm-hmm. So it is really attractive. You can commingle the licit and the illicit goods and value within that.
How pervasive do you think this problem is? What has your research shown?
Well, any estimates in this space kind of have to take them with a grain of salt. And any research that's been done and the small amount of data that's kind of been gathered, we don't know what we don't know and what we haven't caught. And because there are so, especially in Canada, the prosecutions and especially the money laundering space, so we haven't caught the cases that we need to actually generate some really useful stats and data out of that. So we can make estimates based on the broader scheme of things. Canada hasn't yet developed a methodology for really assessing the scope and scale of trade-based money laundering, TBML, in Canada. But we can kind of look to, and this is something that Todd Hatley and I did in one study, is really drawing on the Financial Action Task Force and some of the more general estimates around money laundering are said to be around 2 to 5% of global GDP every year in general. And again, we have to take that with a grain of salt. That's very not precise.
Right. But even if you're talking 1%, I mean, it's an enormous amount of money.
Exactly. It's huge. Yeah, it's huge amounts of money. And I mean, we're talking about saying up to $5 trillion under this estimate. Some have said higher, some have said lower. So, but we can kind of ballpark it in there. Mm-hmm. But then if we overlay that with the amount of trade every year, current US dollar value of world merchandise trade, and this is just from, I think, 2023 stats,
right.
$24 trillion in trade was moved around the world in 2023. If we take 5% of that, that's still over $1 trillion. Mm-hmm. So that could be potentially laundered through trade. And again, I'm using the word potentially here quite strongly. But if we look at there was a recent study, researchers in the European Union did an interesting study using some stats and a number of different databases. And they actually estimated that TBML levels in the region and in just the EU were averaging up to 1.8 trillion US dollars a year. So huge numbers. Then if we scale that down, look at Canada, we're dealing with over $1.5 trillion in trade every year, moving export and import combined. 5% of that is over $70 billion. So that's the potential value that we can look at being laundered through our trade. So it really is this underbelly of globalization here. I mean, we have this trade that's essential for economic prosperity, and on the other hand, the security risk.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming, even some of the discussions going on about deglobalization, et cetera, it's a term we have to be careful with, but this is a component of Canada-U.S. trade, Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade.
Absolutely, yeah. And that proximity to the U.S. and being such significant trade partners, of course, that opens up a lot of vulnerabilities as well. But we are talking beyond. We have trade partners. Look at how much trade there is with China every year. And just the sheer volumes going in and out. So it is really a global problem. But the Canada-U.S., absolutely, that relationship is a big vulnerability and necessity, of course, as well as we know that drug trafficking is the top producer of proceeds of crime. That is still a global issue. And we know that a lot of that money and those drugs are coming from South America. And there are channels straight through up to Canada for that.
So when we're thinking about the different criminal activities that this would be associated with is it mostly the drug trade? Or you mentioned a few at the beginning.
Yeah, so drug trade is still the number one producer of proceeds of crime. And that's likely due to kind of the U.S.-led war on drugs as well that we've seen for decades now. But there are other significant crimes that are fueling it. So human trafficking is growing in its significance, sex trafficking as well, exploitation, especially women and children moving cross borders. And that's not even just the Canadian region. We have seen cases in Canada, though, where proceeds of crime being generated through human and sex trafficking, arms trafficking, so the global arms trade. Right. And that's not even touching on our more adjacent issues around illicit financial flows through trade. So things like sanctions evasion and the much wider issues, capital flight.
Right. Well, I think you've mentioned some of your research with Todd Hatley, so I'll just briefly mention the book you co-edited with Christian Leuprecht. Both Todd and Christian have been on this podcast before, Dirty Money, Financial Crime in Canada, and your article there. I'll include a link on the website to that because it is available in a free PDF format online. In that article, you do talk about kind of a spectrum here that extends from, white collar crime through to the examples you just gave. I'm wondering if there's any more light you can shed on that. Like, are there activities that maybe are in the gray space of legality here that are also would look like this, or if you're trying to discern out the truly transnational crime from other tax evasion or other purposes that might be more use transnational institutions but are more national jurisdictions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of crimes that generate a lot of money, have a lot of dirty money. So they can look even to corruption. We know that money is moving in and out across our borders. Things that aren't even necessarily illegal. So some of our industries being taken advantage of, and I'll get into a number of them because I'm not sure what can be shared yet out of those. But certain industries in Canada are taken advantage of by foreign actors, and the money from that is being sent back overseas. So the Canadian industries are absolutely being exploited through that. And then we've seen a number of, over the years, the Pandora Papers, the Paradise Papers, those are all big tax evasion cases that came out of that. And of course, that money has to be shifted in a number of different ways, and trade will absolutely be one of the ways that that's done.
Maybe we could get a little more concrete. There's a few different ways I'd be keen to hear your views. One is, are there certain goods, services, commodities, activities that are particularly, that might serve as a good example, for instance, to show how this is done? And are you kind of able to give like a Coles Notes sort of version of like, what does this actually look like?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the big vulnerabilities, and this is largely a regional issue as well. So certain regions are more affiliated with certain vulnerabilities in certain industries. So then the US has a number of prosecutions and a number of court cases that actually really outline how the people at the center of this, the criminals, did it. And quite a few of them that I've seen lately have come back to gold. So to give kind of the full timeline of how that works. So a lot of Colombian cartel, for example, this is one of the recent ones that I was looking at. Colombian cartel smuggled a significant amount of drugs into the US, sold those drugs for cash, of course. And then that cash was deposited in really small amounts. So the smurfing technique in a number of different bank accounts. And that was then used to purchase gold that the cartel will export from Colombia. But the group of jewelers in New York is melting down that gold and casting them as these low-value hardware items. So things like nut bolts, buttons, that kind of thing. So it doesn't actually look like gold bullion.
Yeah.
Those hardware items that are actually gold but don't look like it are exported back to Colombia at a really undervalued rate. Right. So they'll take it and say, yes, it's just hardware. It's worth $25. In reality, we're dealing with millions. And then when they get back to Colombia, they're melted down and they're recast as this gold bullion again. Then that cartel can re-export the gold bullion to the United States. They're sold again and used to repatriate those additional funds from the drug sales to Colombia. So that's quite a typical and textbook case of more of the cartels that are shifting value through trade. But there's been a number of other that the luxury goods and art sectors are quite vulnerable to it, because when you think about it, things are worth what people will pay for them.
Right.
So an art that's worth $20 to one person could be 50,000 to another. So there's been quite a few cases actually dealing with diamonds and art to launder money through trade. So basically they just undervalue the diamonds and the art, and then they're sold when they reach the other side, because those values aren't ever compared when they go actually through the supply chain. And they shift hundreds of millions of dollars abroad using different fake companies, front companies, shell companies, number of different bank accounts, number of different identities, fake and not. So it becomes kind of this big web of hiding what these transactions relate back to.
Right. Oh, that's that's very interesting. So obviously a different collection of criminals are needed to kind of make this happen. Maybe a question I have coming from that is, how do you catch this? I mean, do you find this first that leads you back to the network, or is it more of a sense you have some idea who's trafficking drugs, and then you look for this as one of the ways in which they might be, dealing with the proceeds of crime, the private sector, it strikes me, would actually be a pretty important component of dealing with this challenge. So yeah, how do you catch this, and who do law enforcement need to work with to identify it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, is how do we get better at this? Because I think we've over focused a little bit on the commodity versus the actual networks that are behind these. So a lot of especially cartels now, are employing professional money launderers as well to actually be shifting the value, as opposed to doing it themselves. So they're set up like professional enterprises, and they will actually have people whose specific job is to launder that money. And they have that really insider knowledge of bank accounts, of tax havens, of shell companies, and they're able to set all of that up. So it just adds this other layer of real professionalization in. So I think what you said about the integration of the private sector, absolutely. And that's something that Todd Hatley's been talking about as well, I know, and wanting to look into that more. And it's a case of trying to incentivize private sector cooperation on this. And I think that's especially relevant in trade-based money laundering, because most of our supply chain is dealing with the private sector. So freight forwarders, customs brokers, shippers, and they all are the ones that actually see most of the supply chain. Whereas by the time it hits our borders, or even the intel that hits before the border, it's too late. So we actually need to get some more cooperation and be able to target some of these networks earlier, as opposed to just targeting those commodities.
Right.
And that comes with a lot more. We need more information sharing. So there's a lot of restrictions on information sharing between national authorities, of course, and different agencies. So things like customs data, the financial institutions that may have things like suspicious activity or suspicious transaction reports. And it creates a real challenge in detecting it, because there are so many people that hold pieces of the puzzle, but we're not cooperating enough on that yet. And I think that is a big disadvantage when we're trying to uncover some of these TBML networks. And then the other big problem is there's a lack of, I think, awareness and a lack of data on it, because we haven't uncovered many cases. We don't actually have a lot to take to move beyond these really general red flags and indicators, and to actually start looking at the networks and an entirety of the supply chain.
I mentioned early on the recent case with TD Bank that's been in the news, facing a very stiff penalty from U.S. authorities. When it comes to this part of the puzzle, and I think that's really what you're describing here, it's kind of a web of activities and the various flows that are there. How vulnerable is Canada? And, I think you've just given a hint of some of the things we could be doing better coordination, more maybe transnational cooperation. But, if you could name maybe a couple of the key spots where Canada really needs to step up so it can, start prosecuting these crimes, disrupting these plots, What do we need to do?
Yeah. So, to answer how vulnerable is Canada, we can just look at the vulnerabilities to answer that. And that's, really the things that can be exploited by this threat. It's generally going to be organized crime. If we're talking specifically about trade, at least money laundering, as opposed to the other financial flows through trade. So I think the biggest vulnerability is the weaknesses in our anti-money laundering regulation. So while it's our legislation regulation around AML in Canada is relatively comprehensive, but has been really criticized for uneven application. So there are sectors like real estate and luxury goods and accounting and the legal field where regulation's a lot weaker. And these gaps can really be exploited through trade. So in order to actually have the frameworks in place, so the people at the center of being able to catch this, like Canada Border Services, like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we actually need to have a framework in place that enables them to do so. And then the resources to actually support that. There's a lack of resources to be able to really go after this, because
resources money, resources people, resources, define that for me.
All of the above. I think we need more specialized people that are working on this. That human element of investigating this kind of thing is going to be absolutely central to bring some of that. We look at some of the successes the US has had, and a lot of that is because people and money has been thrown at the problem and are able to investigate it a bit more. And we also need the political will behind it to actually change and make our legislation more fit for purpose in terms of being able to target some of these really vulnerable sectors. And that all goes back to this really, where in terms of resourcing, the volume of trade is huge. We're looking at, there's 50,000 cargo ships out floating on international waters, moving, 25,000 containers, or 20-foot equivalent unit containers, each of them up to that. And a lot of those are going through Canada. That's just ships. Then we add in, rail, we add in air cargo. There's a lot of movement. And we don't have appropriate export controls to actually look at those. And to
Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I think that's an aspect, again, that's come up with some recent seizures of drugs in British Columbia. When you talk about export controls, you can understand that a whole bunch of different ways. What are you referring to in this case?
Yeah, so there's a real lack of actually targeting outbound containers or cargo, whatever we're talking about in terms of cargo moving out or goods moving out. So I think we deal with a really heavy import control country. And that's, of course, to protect, we don't want bad things coming into the country. Of course, that goes without saying. But we really need to focus more on what is actually going out. So things like vehicles going out, gold going out undervalued, electronic goods going out overvalued or undervalued. There's this really, there's a big focus on compliance around things like duties and taxes on imported goods and security of goods coming in. We obviously don't want guns and drugs and bad things and people coming in, but TBML cases are really exploiting those lax export reporting requirements and really low examination rates. So few containers and cargo shipments are actually examined. So
how do we compare on that? Compared to, say, the United States or Australia, examples you're familiar with, like in terms of that outbound exams, how do we compare?
I'd say that's a pretty global problem, actually. There's some countries that are more export focused, like Panama, for example, but that is a really big, I think, a consequence of our economic and our national security and our traditional frameworks around customs and immigration and biosecurity. So when the CBSA was formed from customs and immigration brought together into one, I think some of those legacy organizations still really silo what the focus is and perhaps stifle what it could be. So turning to more of and again, this comes down to resources. I mean, we need a lot of people and a lot of technology and a lot of money to actually do this. But to actually be able to go out and match up what are these trade documents saying with what is actually going out there, and to be able to inspect things. But you look at finding it's a needle in a haystack of needles that you're looking for in a lot of these cases. So you need to be able to leverage more of I think technology and more of an enforcement and export control. But I mean, Australia is very similar, very, very import focused as opposed to export. The US, I think, does a bit better job on controlling some of the exports a bit more. And a lot of that comes out of their really heavy sanctions
They did.
frameworks and sanctions legislation. So they do tend to have more resources in that area, but it's still our states are very much focused on import controls.
I guess it becomes someone else's problem. So
Exactly.
it sounds like there's clearly room for cooperation. Maybe just to focus in on, you're doing some of this cross-border research, on this question. I mean, how effective could it be if, particularly Canada and the United States, Mexico has challenges with law enforcement, but maybe it needs to be trilateral. But what can Canada and the U.S. do? How much could they do together to counter this?
Well, we're always stronger together, and that U.S.-Canada border has such a deep, rich history as well of cooperation. So that needs to be leveraged, and we can actually combine a lot of resources and data and intelligence in that to have a better idea of what's flowing across our borders. Because this is, again, about flows, not just about that line in the sand, as it were. So
Right.
we really come back to, we are dealing with the same things going across our borders. So we should work together a bit better. And the United States has the trade transparency units. And of course, Canada is signing on to have one as well. But those can be improved a lot through cooperation between the two countries, as well as partner countries that are also signing on to the trade transparency units. But there's a lot of weaknesses in those as well. So those are basically intelligence sharing platforms where we share trade data. So how can we compare what's declared on export and what's declared on import? And then we can come up with some of those value gaps. But the problem is it's not in real time. And Canada and the US don't share export information.
Yeah.
That's one of our legacy agreements. So things like that could really be overcome to really start sharing more information and intelligence to not only protect our shared borders, but the global landscape of it as well. They're two very well-resourced, for all intents and purposes, well-resourced countries that have strong economies and see significant trade between the two of them. So by partnering up and working together better, cooperation is the way to really advance anything in this space. So I think it goes beyond Canada and the US as well, but Canada and the US can definitely work together more efficiently and effectively to share and come up with some better strategies.
Sort of given the importance of the trade relationship, but you'd imagine with the Five Eyes and with the European Union, et cetera, we could no doubt find a more comprehensive. It's great because what I think you've really helped frame for me here is that we're actually talking about another dimension of economic security and supply chain security. So, often I think a lot of our discussions in recent months and for the last couple of years have been more about protecting supply chains from coercive economic activities by, the People's Republic of China, by the Russian Federation, and others, where this is kind of speaking to some of the threat from within as well as without and at the non-state level.
Exactly.
I think I'd be a bit remiss here. I mean, if I didn't ask, so the criminality here is clear. It's connection to trade, which is, the lifeblood of much of the Canadian economy. Are there political aspects to this? I mean, we've seen the rise of protectionism, economic nationalism in the United States being very much debated in the current presidential election. Does this issue create any political exposure for Canada with the U.S., with others, particularly thinking about the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement coming up for review in 2026. Is there anything here, and we can even make it wider than trade-based money laundering, but on this particular piece, is there anything we should be worried about kind of catching fire politically?
Well, absolutely. As with any significant criminality, I mean, there are definitely consequences for failing to get on top of this. So look what happened with TD Bank. And that's a significant, I think, a significant political issue there. It was the U.S. that got on top of that and issued biggest fine in history for failing to adhere to anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing requirements. But things like trade, I mean, if we're seen as this weak link in the process, that's going to have significant implications on trade partnerships. So why would, if there's certain countries that are wanting to step up and make supply chains more secure or cooperate more with foreign governments, and Canada is not on board with that and not stepping up to actually strengthen our own frameworks and our abilities to investigate and prosecute. We're very weak on prosecutions, money laundering in general in Canada. So I think that does have a significant political implication. It's where is this political will to get behind this? And why doesn't our government want to, or why don't they have the ability to back this a bit more? We know there is a lot of dirty money flowing through Canada into it and out of it. Yet we don't have the resources or the appropriate application of our legislation and regulations to actually tackle it. So, of course, that has political implications. I think
that's
seriously.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, we have a federal election coming up here at some point. The government has promised a national security strategy. I think you've done a good job here of at least convincing me that this is another example of where we need to be thinking beyond the institutions that we have to the problems that exist, and seeing if, what you've described sounds like national security dimensions for sure. Jamie, thanks so much for this. This has been great. I've really appreciated you taking the time to take us through what is a complex issue, but making it very clear. I will put a reference, as mentioned, to your book on dirty money, financial crime in Canada, which will help people get if they want to review some of this and understand a little bit better. I'm going to actually put some other links in the bottom to some of, we mentioned Todd Hatley a couple of times, to his podcast with us. Some of what you mentioned echoes very well with what Alan Burson, former head of the United States Customs and Border Protection, talked about. So it really, really integrates in. Thanks again so much.
Thank you so much for having me. A pleasure to speak with you again.
For Inside Policy Talks, I'm Alex DL. I look forward to seeing you next time.